Hello and welcome to this week's Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest. Our daily newsletter has no sponsors and we carry our podcasts without any advertising. We are an independent voice supported only by our subscribers, and with your help, we're going to keep it that way. Check us out at arabdigest.org. When you get to the website, you'll find details on how to receive our reader-supported daily newsletter for 2 months for free. If you haven't already, give us a try. You won't regret it. My guest today is Caroline Rose. She's the Director of Military and National Security Priorities at New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Among the several hats that Caroline wears at New Lines, she's an expert on the Captagon trade, and that's the subject of our conversation today. Caroline, great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's lovely to be back.
You know, it's been just about a year since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. King Captagon, Bashar al-Assad, along with his criminal family, are gone. So just before we get to the Captagon in Sudan story, what has been the approach of the new al-Shara regime towards dismantling the Assad-Captagon empire?
I think that what we've seen quite literally on day one, as soon as al-Shara and HTS forces entered the gates of Damascus, and when we heard al-Shara deliver a victory speech at the Umayyad Mosque, even in that victory speech, al-Shara mentioned how they really wanted to dismantle this public perception of Syria serving as the hub for Captagon production and smuggling. And since then, we have seen a very impressive counter-narcotics campaign cracking down not only on existing drug supply, but also the networks behind them and the production centers behind them. We've seen over 5 labs seized, hundreds of thousands of pills, as well as, of course, a series of arrests against individuals that were notable and very aligned with the former Assad regime's manufacturing operations. For example, individuals like Wasim Badia al-Assad, who was a cousin of Bashar al-Assad, who ran several manufacturing and trafficking operations. He was arrested through a double agent operation conducted in Lebanon. They brought him back into Syria. We've also seen the arrest of notable traffickers like Amr al-Sheikh, who interestingly, he fled to Sudan, then into Iraq, and then into Turkey. And of course, other individuals that played a role in the former regime's Captagon apparatus. I think now where we stand, of course, the Captagon trade is not entirely eradicated in Syria. It would be impossible to do so, just given the fact that there is continued demand. It is a very cheap and easy drug to make. However, we have seen the downsizing of industrial scale manufacturing operations into much smaller manufacturing operations. They've also moved into contested areas like Syria South and along the Syrian-Lebanese border, potentially also in northern Syria along borders with Iraq and Turkey. But that being said, I think that they've had a very successful year against the Captagon trade. And they are showing very promising results when it comes to really trying to diminish the presence that the Captagon trade has within Syria.
So taking down Captagon in Syria, it sounds like they're committed, they're getting the job done. But look, the market for Captagon remains strong. And while Syria is no longer the hub, you've uncovered strong evidence that a new hub has emerged in war-ravaged Sudan. Why and how has that happened, Caroline?
So there was a piece actually that came out from Arab News that really provided, I think, the basis of the investigation that we refer to in the piece at New Lines. And it was a very fascinating investigation into an industrial scale laboratory that was identified this last February, where they found industrial scale production materials that had a lot of similarities to the ones that we've seen in the labs that have been uncovered this last year after the fall of the Assad regime inside Syria. Interestingly, the investigation also identified smuggling materials and packaging materials that may encompass some linkages to Syria-based criminal networks. For example, packaging material that expressed and stated the name of a company based in Damascus that was used to essentially hold amphetamine powder for Captagon production. So it's very interesting. We're trying to identify exactly how strong these connections can be. It's uncertain whether these are completely new illicit networks that are erupting in Sudan, or whether this is somewhat of a spillover from Syria, where Syria-based criminal networks are seeking out new sites inside Sudan to carry on illicit Captagon production. It's also very clear that Sudan is providing very conducive conditions for both smuggling and manufacturing. Of course, we did not only see the seizure of this one Captagon laboratory this year. There have also been several Captagon interdictions where authorities have uncovered a few hundred or 1,000 pills, which indicates that Sudan is certainly becoming a site of concern. By no means is it a hub like we saw Syria or Lebanon, but it is something that we are looking very closely in the after the fall of the Assad regime in Syria.
Yeah, and it seems, Caroline, that what is conducive to the manufacturing and the distribution of Captagon is war. In Syria, it was civil war. Here in Sudan, we've got another terrible, vicious civil war. And and I want to ask you about this aspect of your piece in New Lines. You argue there is strong evidence that the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, are deeply involved in the production and distribution of Captagon. So what have you found out on that front?
Certainly. So we found that actually quite a few seizures they were conducted inside of RSF territory, particularly the large scale laboratory bust in Khartoum that occurred when the RSF controlled the city. And we found that as RSF forces retreat westward in the face of some of these territorial losses, we've seen some signs of production following as well as seizures following as they've relocated. There's also, of course, the fact that Captagon does serve as a very lucrative alternative revenue stream. And so in this environment of conflict and ongoing civil war, it is no surprise that drug production as well as smuggling has emerged, given the fact that this, just like it provided non-state and militant actors inside Syria, this could also provide RSF units with a stream of revenue.
Mm.
Uh, we have seen two major Captagon lab seizures in northern Khartoum while they were under the effective control of the RSF. Until March, the RSF had established strongholds in northern and central Khartoum. And interestingly, we have seen that also coincidence of Captagon laboratories being identified. Also, we have seen Captagon seizures conducted outside of RSF-controlled territories, at ports and within cities and along key trade routes as well. So it does show that, this could be an issue that is not necessarily contained to just the RSF within Sudan.
Yeah, that's the next question I want to ask you because, of course, the other side of the civil war is the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces. Now they control Port Sudan, which again you identify as a key city, a port city in the distribution network. Have you come across any evidence that the SAF is profiting from the Captagon trade?
Not as much, and only the fact that Captagon consignments have targeted SAF controlled ports of entry as well as sites under their control, which could indicate that these smugglers understand that SAF officers as well as custom forces could be corrupt and as a result would play a role in trying to transmit these Captagon consignments. It's notable that both the RSF and the SAF have been reported to engage in illicit practices, like, for example, fuel smuggling, smuggling of medicines, food, even things like Starlight satellite dishes. And so there is that, landscape of bribery and corruption that I think many traffickers are going to try and exploit.
Yeah, and it's as you say, where there's all this other smuggling going on, you can expect that Captagon's going to be part of that in large part because it's, as you said, very cheap to manufacture and it's not that difficult to conceal it and move it through the system. Well, coming back to the RSF, though, the UAE stands accused of arming the RSF in its war of genocide, which is ongoing now in Darfur and is heavily implicated in the illicit gold trade coming out of Sudan. But I'm just wondering, given some of the adverse publicity the UAE is now getting for its backing the RSF, how are the Emiratis dealing with the Captagon issue and with Sudan and this new emerging hub?
Certainly, that's an excellent question, especially given the fact that the UAE notably was a partner of the Assad regime and a backer of Assad's attempt for normalization with the region at large. I think that, the UAE, there's no evidence whatsoever that, the state has enabled state sponsorship of Captagon inside of Syria. I think that Captagon certainly was a point of contention between the Assad regime and the UAE, given the fact that the UAE also has received many, many Captagon consignments on an industrial scale. Certainly not as much as their neighbor, Saudi Arabia, but still the UAE does represent a large market for Captagon. So definitely the Emiratis were targeted as kind of a victim of the Assad narco diplomacy campaign. Now, it's very difficult to ascertain whether there is any sort of connection with Captagon, the RSF, and the UAE. But I will mention that it is notable that many former Assad officials, as well as entrepreneurs and cronies that engaged closely with the regime, they have fled to places like the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. And from my conversations with officials across the region, there is a concern that these individuals, as they have fled, are trying to expand operations either inside of the UAE or elsewhere. And so there certainly, I think, is a notable connection between the UAE and the RSF. This could potentially explain why we've seen now this increase in Captagon related activity inside of the country, but there is no solid evidence.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Caroline Rose, Director of Military and National Security Priorities at New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, we've touched on this before in earlier podcasts about Captagon, that it was in Syria, it was used there as a stimulant for fighters, but also by starving civilians to suppress hunger. So in Sudan, we've got fighters, we've got starving civilians, huge numbers. So is this same sad story emerging in the Sudan conflict?
It's difficult to tell whether there is widespread consumption within Sudan. Likely, a lot of the consignments that we have seen routed through Sudan are destined for Gulf destination markets. It's made a lot of sense that Captagon production has emerged consistently in Sudan. We've seen labs over the last 3 years at least. And that's just because it's across the Red Sea. It's an easy route to try and target destination markets in the Gulf, particularly in Saudi Arabia. Now, we have seen, as in cases before in Iraq, in Jordan, and elsewhere in the region, where a transit market becomes eventually an emerging consumption market. This is particularly the case in Iraq and in Jordan, where over the years, as Captagon has been routed through, there has been an emerging market for consumption of Captagon. And so I think in Sudan that also there's very conducive conditions for Captagon consumption to thrive. And that's because, as you mentioned, we see a country that is torn by civil war, by trauma. There is food insecurity. There's certainly income insecurity. And Captagon is a stimulant that can address all of these different dilemmas. Captagon can allow users to stay up later. It can allow them to stave hunger. It can allow them to work multiple shifts. It can then also allow them to, use this drug as a way to escape feelings of trauma and pain. And so as a result, I could certainly imagine Captagon consumption on the rise in Sudan. Unfortunately, there's been no surveys, no data, no studies conducted inside of the country that attempt to measure Captagon consumption.
Mm.
All we have is seizure data. But since we've seen more incidents of Captagon seizures in the country, I think that this is definitely a concern that we have moving into 2026.
Yeah, yeah. Now, uh, you have uncovered this developing Captagon hub in Sudan. The first step in shutting down would be, as in Syria, to end the civil war, but no one sees that happening anytime soon, given the complexities, number of militias, in addition to the RSF and the SAF that are involved in this war. So that's unlikely. But what recommendations do you have, Caroline, for the time being, to try and curtail, at least curtail the Captagon industry that's emerging in Sudan?
It's a great question. As you just mentioned, I think, what I would love to see happen is the conclusion of this absolutely terrible civil war that has ensued in Sudan. I think that, when you take away these conducive environments that are ridden by conflict, you take away a lot of the free space that criminality can enjoy and exploit. And so as a result, I think that the Civil War has a lot to do with this emergence of the Captagon industry. But also there are other factors that, that come into play and definitely routes and pathways for action that we can pursue. Number one is demand. So, the Captagon trade will always thrive. It doesn't matter where it will thrive, but it will always thrive if there is an active consumption market and if there are high demand levels. That's why in the wake of the Assad regime's fall in Syria, that's why we've seen the Captagon trade very much continue, just in different sites. So, if we want to see the Captagon trade reduced in Sudan, but also elsewhere in the international community, we need to work on reducing demand levels. What does that look like? It looks like certainly raising awareness about the Captagon trade, who makes it, what's inside of this drug, what the effects are. It also includes harm reduction approaches, as well as, of course, increasing rehabilitation opportunities. Also, of course, countries taking a hard look at the socio and economic and political drivers of Captagon consumption in the first place. For example, in the Gulf, there are not many recreational opportunities outside of urban sites like Riyadh or Jeddah. And so as a result, a lot of, Saudi youth, they resort to Captagon out of boredom. Sometimes also university students use it as a way to increase and bolster productivity. These are all reasons that public health sectors as well as government should really try and evaluate and address. Additionally, I think that it is very important to try and work with countries that are engaged in Sudan. So, for example, like the United Arab Emirates, try to engage the UAE on coordinating with the RSF to try and encourage them to also reduce their role. And then also, of course, trying to bolster interdiction capacity, not only just in Sudan, but also in neighboring countries, because oftentimes this is coming through overland routes, not just maritime routes. And so, Sudan, neighboring countries around Sudan, they also need to bolster their capacity for interdiction.
Yeah, I was just thinking about you're mentioning that Saudi youth not much to do, and I've been told that at some of these raves that have been encouraged by Mohammed bin Salman, the Captagon is flowing freely. So it's out there, it's still out there, and you're right. I mean, these countries that are the big markets need to be addressing that issue. Can I just finally ask you one more question, Caroline, which is this administration, the Trump administration, it's cracked down so hard on U.S. aid. It's impinging on academic freedoms. It's hammering at the media. Is that going to harm in any way your work to try and get this Captagon situation sorted out?
I hope not. I think that, one thing I suppose that is positive is that the administration is paying attention to criminal networks, though of course through a different lens than our project. Of course they're designating many of these criminal networks and syndicates and cartels as terrorist organizations. But as a result, there is, I think, increased attention to the crime terror nexus. And so, what our work is doing at New Lines is trying to highlight the very complicated and fragile relationship between crime and conflict, how conflict-ridden environments encourage criminality, how criminality can encourage conflict, and that interesting and very complicated relationship between these two phenomenon.
Mm.
And I think that the Trump administration might pay some attention to this, though I do wish that they can understand that nuance between these two factors, especially when it comes to cartel organizations that are operating in Venezuela and Mexico. We, of course, have seen a very large scale campaign conducted by the Trump administration that has a very heavy kinetic component. And I worry that we won't necessarily see a lot of success with these sorts of kinetic campaigns against cartel networks, and will drive these networks underground. They will identify new synthetic substances to produce new routes, new modus operandi, and as a result, it will be harder to monitor and harder to interdict and counter. So I think that we're definitely open to the fact that there seems to be a bit more interest in the crime conflict nexus. But we hope that it won't continue to be confused for the crime terror nexus, as so there are so many criminal syndicates that do not meet the definition of a terrorist organization.
Yeah, yeah, and nuance is something I don't think we could accuse the Trump administration or the self-declared Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, of having a lot of, I mean, blowing fishing vessels out of the water off the coast of Venezuela is not a nuanced approach. But you've made a really important distinction there, and one that hopefully someone is listening to in the Trump administration. But for the time being, thanks again, Caroline, and keep up the good work on the Captagon front.
Thank you so much, Bill, for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was Caroline Rose, Director of Military and National Security Priorities at New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. You can find her latest Captagon article at newlinesinstitute.org. Arab Digest is a truly independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No advertising and no sponsors. In the information overload world in which we all find ourselves, Arab Digest keeps it simple. One insightful article a day, and the weekly podcast from top experts, analysts, writers, and commentators. Here at Arab Digest, we have put together a team of contributors like Caroline you're not going to find anywhere else. When you go to the website, arabdigest.org, be sure and look out for the offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. We thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.